Hello, test, hello. Audio is good, Brother Anwar? Okay. And hello, test, hello, hello. Just testing my audio as well. We'll get started in just 2 minutes, inshallah. This talk came about for a very specific reason. We are in a historic moment where the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian issue, has, I think we can accurately say, gone mainstream. So for those of us who have been plugged into this qadiyya, this plight, for a long time, and for those of us who have been paying attention, I think we can agree that it has never received this level of mainstream attention and mainstream acceptance. And so with that, you have a now enormous Free Palestine movement. And that broad tent, that huge umbrella, encompasses within it people who otherwise probably would not be coalescing together. I want to start off by saying this. On the whole, the level of cohesion between Muslims and non-Muslims on this issue has been remarkable in different countries with different activists, and I'm in contact with people all over the world, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in Australia, here, the level of cooperation and cohesion on this issue, on the issue of the Palestine question and the Palestinian people and their rights and their suffering and standing up against this genocide, the level of cooperation has been tremendous. Not only that, but as both a Palestinian but a Muslim, having lived in Greater Vancouver my entire life, I have never seen the Muslim community this united on any single issue ever. I have never seen 300 masajid across Canada all coming together to say that we will not allow any genocide enablers in our masajid over any other issue. Even at the height of the Iraq war, right? We lived through that. Even at the height of the Arab Spring, even in any other instance that I can think of, I never saw this level of cohesion. And so is this movement divided? I'm going to put a positive spin on it and say no. So then why am I talking about this issue? Why bother? Why take an hour of your time? And the reason is because I have found that recently, both here in Canada and the United States, as well as what I've heard from activist friends in Australia, is that conversations have started to emerge about who has the right to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people. So in some cases, I'll give you 2 instances in mind that kind of made me realize, okay, it's best to get out ahead of this and start speaking about the subject before it becomes a problem, rather than wait for the divisions to set in and really become a major problem. So the 2 instances that came to my attention look like this. In one case, there were Palestinian activists. I'm assuming that they are Palestinian. I've never met them. The whole debacle emerged online. But there were some activists who were upset that a an imam, a non-Palestinian imam, in fact a convert, was speaking on behalf of the Palestinian people. And their claim was that you don't have that right. Okay? They were saying that you are not a Palestinian, therefore you don't have the right to speak on their behalf. Okay? And it became a very heated issue because the personalities involved were very high-profile personalities. In another case, I have activist friends who have told me that some leading members in the Muslim community in Australia were telling Palestinian activists, stop saying that it is the Palestinians who are suffering because it is the Muslims who are suffering. Essentially telling these Palestinian activists that the way that you're speaking about this is not constructive and it is inaccurate. And so I realize at this point, and it's still, the divisions are in their infancy, these problems will not go away. And so what I want to accomplish today is first help us understand why these divisions exist, and to help us understand how we can best speak about the Palestinian issue accurately and with a commitment to a vision that we feel comfortable with. The first thing I want to address is how Palestinians themselves view their identity and their struggle. And without a doubt, when you are speaking about a subject of this magnitude, it does help to actually reflect on how the people who are actually suffering, how they view themselves and their plight, rather than having the conversation take place in the diaspora. Let me just take a moment to reflect on one valuable thing, I dare say one beautiful thing that has emerged from this incredibly ugly war. We can finally put to rest, we as the Muslims, we can finally put to rest decisively, definitively, once and for all, the myth that the Muslims of the West are the vanguard of this ummah. Okay, let me explain what I mean by this. For almost as long as I've been living, there's been in the background of our community, and maybe I'm just projecting here, maybe you guys will tell me you've never heard anything like this, maybe it's not going to sound familiar to you, but for as long as I've been living and as long as I've been a part of the Muslim community, there's been this kind of sense that the Muslims of the West, with our multilingualism, with our education, with our connections, with our resources, with our passports, we are going to liberate the Muslim world. We are going to be the ones at the forefront of a project to lift the Muslims out of their state of oppression. And I think immediately after October of 2023, we can definitively say that it is actually they who will liberate themselves, and we are not the vanguard. We are not the elite that we think we are. And so it stands to reason then that if the Muslims and the Palestinians specifically are liberating themselves, and we are advocating for them, it stands to reason that we should understand their identity as well as we can. And here I will summarize it as simply as I possibly can. Your identity is a story that you tell about yourself. The story that you tell about yourself is deeper than blood. It is more powerful than your skin color. It is more powerful than your last name. The story itself is actually at the core of your identity. I will elaborate on this very, very briefly. The extent to which you care about your last name, or you care about your heritage, you care about your country, you care about anything, you care about your Islamic identity, is rooted in your belief that you are part of that narrative. it's very difficult to care for and love Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam if you don't know the story of his life. The story of the life of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is essential to the identity of a Muslim. And every Muslim who connects with that story sees themselves and sees their challenges reflected in the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Your family story, if you care about it and you preserve it, feels like an integral part of who you are. At the same time, to give you like a really immediate example within our community, most of us come from ancestral homelands with tribes. Tribes in some way, shape, or form. Small tribes, big tribes, massive tribes, but by and large, the Muslim world is inundated with tribes. If I ask the people in this room, how many of you know, first of all, just by show of hands, how many of you come from countries where tribes are part of the social fabric? Anyone here? Does anyone here come from a country where they have tribes, clans? Yeah, okay, I'm getting some nods. Do all of you know what tribes or clans that you are from? Because I will tell you this, if there were Somalis in the audience, all of them would know. I have never met a Somali of any age who does not know what tribe they are from. I have never met one. I live in Surrey, I've met a lot, and I have this conversation a lot. And the reason is their tribes are important to them, and they tell the stories of their tribes, and it becomes a deep part of their identity. But the stories that you stop telling because they are no longer meaningful to you, those identities die. Your identity is a story that you tell about yourself. And Muslims tend to carry around with them numerous stories that we care about deeply. So it's very normal to feel completely plugged into, zealous about your Islamic identity, while also feeling enthusiastic, very enthusiastic about your Arab identity, and very enthusiastic about your Palestinian identity. And if you meet any of these people, a Palestinian like the one that I'm describing in this hypothetical, they'll also be very passionate about their identity of being from Nablus, or being from Haifa, or being from Gaza, or being from whatever. And for Muslims around the world who carry around all of these different identities, they don't feel like they contradict with each other. Quite the opposite. These identities feel like they complement one another. If this point is not clear enough, then I'll use another quick example before I carry on. There is almost no definition. I have a friend who's like an expert in Pakistani politics. So he references this a lot. He says, there's no definition of Pakistani that is independent of Islam. The Pakistani identity, the nation state of Pakistan, and Islam, these identities are intertwined. They are together, they're meshed together. And if I ask, I teach children for a living, right? I teach grade 6 and 7 at an Islamic school. And if I ask my Somali students, if I ask Lebanese students, if I ask Jordanian students, if I ask Syrian students, what is Libya's Independence Day? What is Syria's Independence Day? What is Jordan's Independence Day? None of them know. But when I ask the Pakistani students, what is Pakistan's Independence Day? They all, they all have the answer, almost all the time. I don't want to exaggerate and say 100%, I'm going to say 80% of them know Pakistan's Independence Day. And I've run this experiment over and over again. Okay, so I've beat this dead horse. I will wrap up this point by saying once again, your identity is fundamentally a story that you tell about yourself. And Palestinians carry with them numerous, sometimes complementary and sometimes conflicting stories. This is important because, well, we will see later how some of these stories developed and the way that different people will emphasize different stories and how that will lead to conflicts about how they articulate their struggle. So you'll often hear something like you should listen to Palestinian voices. But then the very reasonable question is, well, who should you listen to then? And this is a problem exacerbated among Palestinians more than other people for two reasons. The question of who speaks on behalf of the Palestinian people is a more difficult question to answer than most other peoples around the world for two reasons. One, is statelessness. The Palestinians do not possess a state. And because they do not possess a state, they do not possess state-like resources, which means they don't have a central library. They don't have a state archive. They don't have a central museum. They don't have a Ministry of Education. They don't have all of these things that engage in the act of storytelling and myth building. They don't have those things. There is such a thing as an official history of Canada, a mainstream history of Canada. If you studied social studies here, or your children are in a social studies program here, they're studying it right now. There is an official mainstream history of the United States. There's an official mainstream, widely adopted history of the United Kingdom. I could go on, but you get the idea. But when you don't have a Ministry of Education, you don't have museums, you don't have an archive, you don't have libraries, you don't have these things, then who is the caretaker of the story? And the answer is everyone becomes a caretaker of the story, which leads me to problem number 2, diaspora. Through their status as refugees, the Palestinians scattered all over the world. And so each family took with it the stories that it had. And most of these families are not historians. This is not their profession. In fact, not only are most of them not historians, I don't have like a number in front of me, but a disproportionate number of Palestinians are doctors and engineers. So they're not even remotely and pharmacists. They're not even remotely in the field of storytelling and historiography. We need to understand what it is that we are trying to answer. When we ask the question, is Palestine a Muslim issue? Well, if we ask the question like that alone, the answer is definitively yes. Khalas, we don't even need to sit here for another hour, we can all go home. Because the suffering of people is a Muslim issue. And the suffering of Muslims is a Muslim issue. Right? So we don't need to have a further conversation. But if the question is, can the Palestinian struggle be understood primarily in Islamic terms? That's a different question. Can the Palestinian struggle be understood primarily in Islamic terms? The answer to that question is still yes, but it's a more specific and intentful question than, is Palestine a Muslim issue? Now, if the question is, should the Palestinian struggle be understood in exclusively Islamic terms? Here I'm not so sure. And that's also, again, a different question. What we are talking about here today, all of this has basically just been an introduction. What we are speaking about here is a question of what framework can we use to understand the Palestinian struggle. And the framework determines how you interact with reality. When you put a lens on, okay, when you view the world through an Islamic framework, you see the world through the eyes of a Muslim. How many of you grew up with siblings? Okay? So if you how many of you grew up with siblings, and how many of you grew up with the stories of the Quran? How many of you as children knew the stories of the Quran? Okay. So if your siblings, I had we were 5, right? So if I'm the second youngest out of 5 siblings. You could imagine a young Muslim child if all of their siblings conspire against them to get them in trouble. Okay, they all, just childhood mischief, right? All their siblings conspire against them. You could imagine this 5 or 6 or 7-year-old child crying in their room, saying, this is just like Yusuf alayhi salam. I'm being betrayed just like and you see yourself in the stories of the Anbiya, right? You find a struggle in your life and you say, this is just like what Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam went through with this person and this person. We see the world through the framework of Islam. And because of that, it shapes the way we interact with reality. We see a tyrant and we say, this is the Abu Jahl of our time. We project our framework upon the reality that we are seeing. So the framework that you have when you're looking at the Palestinian people is actually very important because it will manipulate how you see reality right in front of you. It determines how you see the best possible future. And it determines from where you seek support. And so, if your understanding of Palestine is through an exclusively Muslim lens, it means the following. Number one, it means that you're seeing the suffering of the Palestinians primarily as the suffering of Muslims. And in fact, you may even be seeing the suffering of Palestinians because they are Muslims. It means that you are seeing the Palestinians, or seeing the struggle of the Palestinians, as one fundamentally between haqq and batil, between truth and falsehood. And so far, I'm seeing most people nod because I think that you agree with this. And by the way, I too agree with this. You are seeing in the Palestinians and the Zionists the stories of the Quran and the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You are seeing this drama unfold in front of you. Here are the last 2 points though, and this is where it becomes tricky. Number one, you believe that help should come primarily or even solely from the Muslims. You believe that when the Palestinians are calling for help and they want someone to help alleviate their pain, they should only look to the Muslims. And we in the diaspora who are active in supporting these people, we should only look to the help of the Muslims, or at least primarily to the Muslims. Now, the reason why that one's a problem is because, are the Muslims always helpful? And are they decisively helpful? Are they sufficiently helpful? Because if you are insisting that the Palestinians only receive help from the Muslims, then you better be pretty helpful. Okay? Like if you're insisting this as a condition, you better have a lot that you're bringing to the table. And secondly, it is a belief that the Muslims are, or at least should be, at the forefront of the struggle for liberation. And again, that's something that takes proof. It's not a claim. If you are facing a genocide, it's not a claim that you're just going to take at face value. And this is why it's important to understand how to frame this issue, how to speak about it, and what it means to look at it through an exclusively Muslim lens. If the question is, can you look at the Palestinian issue, its past and its present and its future, in primarily Muslim terms, then the first 3 points, seeing the suffering as primarily the suffering of Muslims, seeing the struggle as one between haqq and batil, seeing in the Palestinians and their struggle against the Zionists, the stories of the Quran and the seerah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those 3 points, you have no problem. But if it's an exclusively Muslim lens, then it also means that help only comes from the Muslims and the belief that the Muslims are at the forefront of the struggle. And those two things, they take proof. And the proof, I do not believe, is sufficiently there at this moment. At this historic moment, I do not see decisive proof of that. So we need to understand what are the other potential frameworks, because there is something that I need to say here clearly and unequivocally. It does not mean, when I say that there is an Islamic framework, it does not necessarily mean that the other frameworks are anti-Islamic or un-Islamic. Okay? I'll give you an example here. Another common framework that people use to understand the Palestinian struggle is an anti-colonial framework, and that is the struggle of an indigenous population combating settler colonialism. There is nothing about viewing the Palestinians as the indigenous population that is somehow un-Islamic or anti-Islamic. Okay? So this is not a dichotomy. I don't want anyone in the room to feel that they have to choose between iman and kufr as they're trying to understand the struggle of the Palestinians. This particular example is something that actually resonates with Muslims because they have a deep connection with the experiences of as being colonized peoples. The people of the Indian subcontinent were colonized. The people of Indonesia were colonized. The people of North Africa were colonized. And because of that extensive experience, this is a framework that many Muslims feel very closely related to. There is a framework that, this one's largely out of vogue at this point, but there's a framework to view the Palestinian struggle as primarily just one more stop in the struggle for Arab unity, essentially as a pan-Arab struggle. And from the 1980s onward, we have a framework that looks at the Palestinian, looks at the Palestinian issue as one rooted in human justice and international law. Essentially, it is about the legal rights of the Palestinians in the form of UN resolutions, in the form of illegal occupations. There is that framework. And so, we revisit the question, how do the Palestinians articulate their own struggle? There is no doubt that the Palestinians, if we look at the Ottoman era onward, which is the era that I have the most exposure to and experience in, that Palestinian Muslims, urban, rural, and Bedouin, definitely saw themselves as Muslims and as members of families attached to villages and cities and arid spaces. But at the same time, the Ottoman world was very diverse, and that diversity was part of their world. I had a lot more to say about the Ottoman era, but I decided to skip it because I felt that it actually convoluted the presentation. So I'm not going to say much more there, but we could revisit it in the question and answer if anyone is interested in the subject. Instead, what I'm going to speak about is how the Palestinians navigated their Islamic identity under the rule of the British, and more importantly, when did the Palestinian issue become a political issue in the Muslim world? When did the Palestinian issue capture the imagination of Muslims around the world? Because I think we can agree right now, and please, I'm happy to pause all of this and anyone can correct me if I'm wrong. Is there any issue in the world that arouses as much passion among Muslims as the Palestinian issue? Whether it's in Jakarta or Islamabad or anywhere, is there anything that has as much broad attention consistently over the last century as the Palestinian issue? Anything else? Anything that comes close? There's nothing quite like it. But there is a finite point in history. There is a moment where the Palestinian issue gained the attention of the Muslim world. Okay, very, very briefly here. The British did not recognize the Palestinians as a national community. They did not recognize that there was such a thing as the Palestinian people, Sha'ab Palestine. Okay? They just saw these as a disparate group of Arabs living between the river and the sea. They are just Arabs. And they did not recognize them as the national community for a very specific reason, because the League of Nations, which was really like Woodrow Wilson's brainchild, but the League of Nations demanded, more or less, that national communities be entitled to national aspirations and statehood. And so they couldn't recognize them as a national community, because then they would need to at least put them on a serious track toward independence. They did recognize the Jewish people as a nation, but they did not recognize the Palestinian people as a people. Instead, what they recognized was that the Arabs existed in confessional communities. There were Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs, but there were no Palestinians. And so, the British created an institution called the Supreme Muslim Council, and it was headed by Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Now, The British did not only create the institution of the Supreme Muslim Council, the British also created the office of the Grand Mufti of Palestine. Palestine never in its history had a Grand Mufti. There was a Mufti of Al-Quds, the Mufti of Akka, the Mufti of Yafa, the Mufti of Safad, but there was never a Mufti of Palestine. So, why did the British create the institution of the Grand Mufti of Palestine? What do you guys think? Why would they create an institution like that? This is 1922. 10 years before that, if the Muslims of Palestine were looking for a decisive fatwa about anything, really, like a decisive landmark fatwa about jihad, about some really important, relevant issue of the time, where would that fatwa have come from? Who would have issued that fatwa? So somebody says, Egypt, Hijaz. 10 years before that, it would have come from Shaykh al-Islam of the Ottoman Empire. By creating the Grand Mufti of Palestine, the British create a marja', they create a religious authority for these people within their physical boundaries. It assures that they will not look to Cairo or Damascus or Baghdad or Istanbul for anything. They will just look inward here. And of course, this is exactly what happens, right? We still live this legacy today, where people, every Muslim majority country essentially has their own Grand Mufti of sorts. And you look to that person, but there is no central authority that you turn to. It's one more step toward keeping the Muslims as compartmentalized and divided as possible. And it worked. On the flip side, though, they created an institution that then managed all of the Islamic endowments in the country. It manages all the Masjid and manages all of these things. And in 1931, the elite of Palestine began to awake to the possibility that the British imperial project and the Zionist settler colonial movement might actually be working together. And if you're sitting here thinking, wasn't that obvious? The answer is, yeah, 100 years later, it's very obvious to us, but they were working in real time in the moment, and it maybe wasn't as obvious to them as it is to us now. But by the 1930s, it became painfully obvious. And so, Al-Hajj Amin al-Husseini decided to convene a massive Islamic Congress in Al-Quds in 1931. And he invited everyone. He invited major Islamic dignitaries from Egypt, from Iraq, from India. He invited Shawkat Ali, who was the head of the Khilafat movement in the Indian subcontinent. Some of you may be familiar with him. The brother of Shawkat Ali, I believe, is actually buried in Al-Quds. So yes, Muhammad Ali is buried in Al-Quds. So these two men were instrumental in the pan-Islamic identity of the Indian subcontinent. They were at this conference. Abdurrahman Azzam from Egypt, he was at this conference. The Shia Marja', Kashif al-Ghita from Iraq, he was at this conference. He invited everyone to come and see the impact of Zionist settler colonialism in Palestine. And it allowed this is 1931, there's no WhatsApp. Okay, there's no TikTok, there's no email threads. Okay, newspapers are able to spread as far as literacy will allow them. Okay, electricity is not universal. So by bringing these ulama from around the world, they were able to see with their own eyes the danger that al-Masjid al-Aqsa was subjected to. We could say at that moment that Palestine became an Islamic issue. You might think, no, it's obvious that Palestine is an Islamic issue because it is Ul al-Qiblatayn wa Thalith al-Haramayn. It's Masjid al-Aqsa, it was the first Qibla, it's the third holiest site in Islam. But even the most compelling story, with the most powerful narrative, still needs to be told. And I think there's very strong evidence that it was being told for the first time at that conference. But the Palestinian story didn't suddenly stop in 1931 and didn't suddenly stop in 1948. Identities are never complete. I said earlier, your identity is a story that you tell about yourself. Okay. Is your family story complete? You have a family story with heroes and villains. Right? There is some ancestor who you're very proud of, and if you know a lot about your family history, then you have at least one ancestor who you're probably ashamed of. Like, if you know enough, you're going to dig there and you're going to find them. Okay, so you have funny stories, you have powerful stories, you have stories that capture the imagination, and you have stories that are humiliating. But is your family story complete? The answer is it's not. Because your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, they will create their own stories. And they will create their own heroes, or they will become heroes. And they will fundamentally change the whole history of your family depending on their accomplishments. And a nation is the same thing. And so the Palestinian story did not stop in that moment, it continued. And there are at least 3 seismic global events that helped shape the trajectory of how Palestinians understood their struggle and understood their story. One is the Cold War. And decades of the Cold War gave some Palestinians a language to describe the struggle that they saw in front of them. It's not really a language that I personally find very compelling, but many others did. A language of the working class, a language of oppressed peoples against the wealthy, the capitalist, the imperialist. This language really emerged as a consequence of the Cold War. The language of Pan-Arabism really emerged after the Egyptian free officer coup and the rise of Jamal Abdel Nasser. Pan-Arabism was not born then. I'm being very reductive here, but I'm also trying to cover a lot of material in a short amount of time. But the language of Pan-Arabism in the mid-20th century also helped Palestinians understand the way that they saw the world. Whether this is a good thing or a bad thing is not what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is that these events shaped the way that some Palestinians saw the world. And the struggle for Algerian independence, the struggle of an indigenous population, primarily a Muslim and Arab indigenous population, driving out a colonial power, was also decisive in helping Palestinians understand their struggle. And there's nothing unnatural with what I'm telling you. How many of you remember in 2005, 2 French boys, at least one of them was a Muslim, were chased down by the police and killed in France, in a suburb in Paris, I think. And the whole country went up in riots. This is during the time of Nicolas Sarkozy. Does anyone remember this? These were huge riots. Try to imagine these Paris suburbs were all on fire. Like it was a major news story for weeks. And this was right on the back of the Intifada, of the second Intifada in Palestine. And I can guarantee you that the Palestinian boys watching the suburbs of France on the news saw themselves in the struggle of those French boys. And those French boys, who were actually Muslim boys, they were Algerian and Tunisian and Moroccan, they saw themselves in the struggle of the Palestinians. And I can guarantee you that African Americans who were watching that also saw themselves reflected in the struggle. So it's normal for global events to shape the way that you see yourself and your struggle. And you develop a new vocabulary, a new arsenal to express what it is that you're experiencing. The consequence of this is that modern Palestinians, knowingly or unwittingly, use terms and symbols drawn from a variety of frameworks to express their identity and their struggle. Palestinians may frequently articulate their struggle in primarily Islamic terms, but they almost never do so in exclusively Islamic terms. Let me, in humor me, if you will, with a brief linguistic analysis to prove my point. We will look at the words that Palestinians use, and that in fact any Arabic speaker uses to describe the Palestinian struggle, and I will show you that there are a variety of frameworks being deployed at the same time, all the time, when it comes to the Palestinian issue. All of the Palestinian factions, all of them, even the secular ones, for their dead, they refer to them as shuhada, or martyrs. This is an Islamic term, right? We have no doubt about this. But when they refer to the Israelis and their presence in somewhere like the West Bank, they refer to them as al-ihtilal, the occupation. Occupation is a legal term. That is borrowed from the legal framework. Okay. For any Arabic speakers here, when we refer to the Palestinians who are engaged in an armed struggle against the Zionists, they're referred to as al-muqawamah, the resistance. Well, that is an anti-colonial term. I've read a lot of Ottoman history. You will never hear about the Ottoman muqawamah or the muqawamah against the Ottoman Empire. That is something that comes straight out of the anti-colonial works of the 20th century. But they're also frequently called mujahideen. That is an Islamic term. The Palestinian struggle in its collectivity is frequently referred to as a thawra. Well, a revolution, thawra, revolution, is very much borrowed from the anti-colonial framework. In fact, historically, in the Muslim lexicon, thawra was a bad word. Thawra, historically, had almost exclusively negative connotations. Now that has flipped on its head, okay? Largely because of our adoption of an anti-colonial framework. The term mustawtin, settler, that is a legal term. The term musta'mir, colonist, that is an anti-colonial term. And the term sha'ab Palestine, that is a nationalist term, because there is an implicit recognition that a sha'ab exists. Right? When we say shu'ub Pakistan, or sha'ab Pakistan, that means that there's a recognition that there is a Pakistani people. So there is a recognition that this people who have this common story of the past and a common understanding of the present and a common vision for the future, that these people exist. But if you're not convinced with that the Palestinians simultaneously borrow from these multiple frameworks, then I offer you something even more decisive. I've engaged in a pretty basic and rudimentary linguistic analysis of the speeches of the spokesperson for Hamas, Abu Ubaidah. Now, if you're not an Arabic speaker, you might not be familiar with who I'm speaking about, so I'm just going to introduce you to this, because in the Arabic-speaking world, the Hamas spokesperson has become something of like a folk hero. His name is not actually Abu Ubaidah. It's a pseudonym. And it's a nod to Abu Ubaidah Amr ibn Jarrah, the Sahabi of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he appears periodically with his face covered in a red kufiyyah. And when he appears in the Arabic-speaking world, everything stops. Like traffic stops, weddings stop. Everyone, there's footage, like go on YouTube and you could see this. Young men like working out at a gym will drop all their weights and they'll gather around the TV screen to listen to what he has to say. And there's a perception that he's speaking the truth, that he's giving unique, intimate insights from the field of battle. And so here's one of his speeches. He says, "O masses of our dear and heroic people, يا جماهير شعبنا العزيز البطل." That's what he says. ويا أحرار العالم الحر الشريف. So he says first, our masses of dear and heroic people. And then he says, O heroes of the free and noble world, we declare openly and clearly. So Abu Ubaidah is not speaking exclusively to the Muslims. He is not speaking exclusively to the Arabs here. He is speaking to the whole world. And then he says, today's battle is not about eliminating the resistance, or even a battle for the freeing or exchanging of prisoners. Today's battle is about settling a score with the Palestinian people. So there is a recognition on the part of Abu Ubaidah that the Palestinian people exist. There is Sha'ab Palestine. And he says that it is about settling a score with the Palestinian people, their resources, and their resistance. A resistance which imposed upon the occupying entity a humiliating and historic defeat. End quote. But perhaps even more to the point, one of his speeches that even more clearly articulates the way that Abu Ubaidah himself borrows from these multiple frameworks as he articulates the struggle of what can only be described as mujahideen. As he articulates the struggle, and as he borrows from these multiple frameworks, he says, quote, the ongoing heroic confrontation which the Palestinian resistance and our people engage in as they repel enemy attacks confirms what we have been saying since the first day of the war. Namely, that we are, God willing, steadfast and capable of resistance for as long as the aggression continues in all of its forms. And he then goes on to say, please listen very carefully, and despite our deep concern about the aggression against our people, we are personally prepared for a long battle of attrition. The enemy will find itself in a quagmire that will result in the loss of soldiers and officers in any operation it carries out in Gaza. And he closes off by saying, quote, we do not say this because we are a superpower. Rather, it is because we are the people of this land and its rightful owners. We are Gaza. We are its sky, its air, its sea, and its sand. And he is saying that the people who are fighting, the people who are standing in front of this oppression, the people who are facing off against tanks, wearing nothing but sandals and t-shirts, these people are the indigenous population of Palestine. This is what he is saying. And so it should be clear from this that as those who are on the front lines borrow from these multiple frameworks to make sense of the reality in front of them, we too should be comfortable doing this. If there's anything that the war in Gaza has proven, it's that these divisions, they're actually, they're exaggerated more in the diaspora than they are in Palestine itself. Because the reality is that if you see in Palestine right now, if you see the muqawmah, if you see the resistance, standing in the face of the Zionist aggression, you will see that all of the factions are united in this struggle. All of the factions and all of their different political persuasions, they're all united in this struggle. The only real division that exists is one along the lines of a few core principles. Do you believe that the Palestinians have the right to resist or not? And do you believe that they have the right to resist with any means at their disposal or not? And do you believe that the Nakba was an injustice that needs to be overturned in its entirety or not? This is the real division that exists. It is not a sectarian division. It is not a confessionalist division. It is not a geographic division. The real division that exists is one on these principles. Do the Palestinians have the right to resist or not? Do they have the right to resist and take back what was taken from them in every inch of Palestine or not? This is the real division that exists. And I will demonstrate this with a quick story. A friend of mine who lives in Palestine, observed something quite interesting. He was at a jewelry store. The whole conversation took place in English. He was at a jewelry store just about a week ago. And he says these two Americans came in. One of them was a woman, and she was looking at this jewelry, and the jewelry is all Palestine themed. And there are, like necklace pendants in the shape of Palestine. There's Palestinian flags and things like that. There's the Dome of the Rock. And the woman liked a pair of earrings. And she said, I like these. And the pair of earrings were two red triangles. So the jeweler said, do you know what these red triangles are? And judging by the quizzical looks on your faces, you guys might not even know what these red triangles are. So I'll explain. So he says, do you know what these red triangles are? The woman said, no. And the jeweler said, in the videos produced by the heroic fighters of al-Salaam, these red triangles appear on top of Israeli soldiers when they're about to be attacked. So in the footage, the combat footage that's put out from the various organizations in Gaza, these red triangles appear basically saying the target is below. It's a way to capture the camera's attention. So I'm going to repeat again what the jeweler said. The jeweler said that these red triangles are used in the footage of the heroic fighters of al-Qassam. Well, it's a story in Palestine. That's not that interesting, right? Except when you learn that the owner of that jewelry store is a Christian. You see, in his mind, he sees this as a just cause. And he sees these as heroic fighters. And he believes that they have the right to be engaged in this struggle. On the other hand, we have Muslim rulers, and we have Muslim politicians, and we have Muslim public personalities who have done as much as they can to distance themselves from Palestine and its resistance and its problems as much as possible. And on some level, I feel closer to the perspective of that jeweler than I do to these tyrants. Well, not on some level, on almost every level. And I think many people in the audience would share that sentiment. I will close off with this. I gave this lecture at another location, and one of the people in the question and answer asked or remarked at the end, he said, I agreed with everything that you said, okay? And we need to work with other people in order to cooperate, to liberate Palestine and all of these things. But the people who carry the banner at the end of the day, the people who are at the front, the people who are leading the struggle, they need to be the Muslims. What I told him is that the haqq of the right to carry the banner is earned, it's not inherited. If you want to carry the banner, if you want to be the one who carries the banner of Palestinian liberation, earn it. Do the work. Right? And the truth is, I said earlier that the Muslims in the diaspora, we are not the vanguard that we thought we were. Because the one who carries the banner is the one who sacrifices the most. And right now, there is nobody on earth sacrificing more than the people of Gaza. And for that reason, the people of Gaza get to determine where this battle goes, who speaks on their behalf, and what they say. They get to determine that, and they are the ones carrying the banner because they are the ones sacrificing the most. If you want the Muslims to be at the forefront of this struggle, if you want the Muslims to be the ones who get to determine how Palestine is remembered, how it is liberated, how it is spoken about, earn it. We need to be the ones doing the work. And I am not so sure that we are currently the ones doing the most work. And so I would like to save the rest of the time for question and answer. I know that was dense and I know that was a lot of information, so thank you all for listening so patiently. I'll open up the floor to questions. Questions, comments, feedback, remarks, anything. And if it's not directly related to exactly the content of the lecture, we can go down a few rabbit holes, I don't mind. Yes, sir?
My position is Christian countries that close their ports, that Israeli no Muslim country has done that. No Muslim country has withdrawn minor things, bring back their ambassador, or do any serious declaration of condemnation. So where are our leaders?
So the brother makes a very powerful point where he says that he feels that the problem has always been the fact that the Muslims have very poor leadership across the Muslim world. Poor and in fact compliant and complicit leadership. Of course I agree with you. You're not going to get any pushback from me. But the leaders are also a reflection of their people. You know, I've been involved in this space for a long time. And a few months ago, it seemed like every city in the world had a 10, 15,000 person protest every week. Okay? You guys remember this, right? And it was in the dead of winter and everything. People were showing up in the snow, in the cold, in the rain. People were showing up. And I watched with some admiration, but I also know that this will pass. And for the Muslims, you've got bills, and you have TV shows, and you have people to visit, and vacations to go on, and you have exams, and then there's that wedding coming up, and there are other, do you really have time to be focusing on the people of Palestine every day? Is this not the reality? Am I describing something that's not true? For the first, I know, right, for the first couple of months of this war, it was all anyone could talk about or think about all day of every day. And slowly, with enough time, enough distance was created and enough violence was inflicted that we kind of became desensitized, and then we moved on to the regular circle of life. I will say something that is purely my opinion. Most of what I say is based on research, and this is just my opinion. I think that on the morning of October 7th, I think the Hamas leadership in exile, I think Ismail Haniyeh, I think Khalid Mash'al, I think the Hamas leadership in exile who are in Istanbul at the time but who are based in Qatar, I think they watched the events of October 7th unfold on TV just like I did. I think they had no idea. I think the opinion that I have, it's not uniquely my own. This is one theory out there, and it's one that I find very compelling. I think they watched the events unfold on the news just like I did, with their jaws dropping, saying, I can't believe this is happening. And I think the number of people inside Hamas who knew about this were probably 2 or 3 or 4 people, maximum. All inside Gaza. And I think as far as a military assault is concerned, that this was a gamble. Now let me explain what I mean by that. There's a German general, a 20th century German general named Erwin Rommel, and he wrote about the difference between a risk and a gamble. He said that a risk is something with a probability of failure, but then you can retreat to a safe position, calculate your losses and rebuild and move on. He says, whereas a gamble is more like a light at the end of a tunnel. Okay? And you don't really have a path of how you want to get there. And he says that people who find themselves in gambles tend to be in situations not of their own making, or sometimes of their own making, but then they need to do one of 2 things. They either need to completely cut their losses and retreat, or they need to throw everything they have, because by doing nothing, a gamble will slowly consume you if you find yourself in a quagmire. Okay? And he uses the example, an author named Robert Greene in a book, The 33 Strategies of War. I read it in high school or something like that, and this passage was very compelling for me. This author, talking about Erwin Rommel's work, uses the example of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as a gamble. Says they went in trying to conquer this country. They had no idea what they were getting into. Light at the end of the tunnel, resources for years, bled them dry, ended up collapsing the Soviet Union. I think that as far as a military operation was concerned, this is what the resistance in Gaza was seeing. They were seeing rapid normalization of the Arab states. They were seeing that Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalization with Israel. They were seeing that the United Arab Emirates was not only in full normalized relations with Israel, but was really enjoying their relationship. They were seeing the same with Morocco, the same with Sudan. They said soon Saudi Arabia is going to be around the corner and the Palestinian issue will be completely forgotten. They will just be left to rot and die. And the gamble was that we want to do something so spectacular and so audacious that it, A, propels the Palestinian issue to the forefront of global affairs, and B, awakens the Muslim world. That's the gamble. If plan A was part of their plan, it was successful. Right now, there is no diplomat on earth who is not speaking about the Palestinian issue. But as far as part B, that's on us. Did the Muslim world wake up or not? Did the Muslims awaken to this or not? Did the Muslims fundamentally change or not? Did the Muslims who knew nothing about this qadiyya, the Muslims who were not paying attention to this for the last 5 or 10 or 15 years, did they suddenly educate themselves, awaken, learn about what's happening? Or did they just go back to their regular routine? So yes, we can blame our rulers, but the rulers are also in part a reflection of their people. Any other questions or feedback or concerns? Yes, Ahmed.
So how do you see that Hamas is standing their ground? Because there was creating statements saying, oh, this leader was killed, this person was killed. Like, is Israel killed?
Okay, so the question was, is the resistance in Palestine standing their ground? Yeah, basically, okay. So the answer is obviously yes, because there's material evidence that we have in the form of like combat footage and things like that. But then you made another point about saying, but so many of their leaders are being killed. Okay. So every resistance faction in Palestine that exists today emerged under Israeli occupation. Every single one. And they have all evolved to deal with exactly this problem. The entirety of, I mean, I might be exaggerating by like 1 or 2 people, but by and large, the entirety of what once represented Hamas's founding members, they've all been assassinated. They've all been killed. And yet the organization is exponentially larger than they could have ever dreamed. So the decentralized nature of guerrilla movements allows for this. If you were to kill like a general in a conventional war, it might be like difficult to replace them. I'm not a military expert, so I don't want to overstep my bounds and tell you exactly what the impact would be, but like killing a... It seems what we've learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that the Russians seem to have quite an appetite for dead officers. Like the Russian military doctrine allows for them to like have a lot of officers, to hemorrhage a lot of officers. The Americans are not like this. The Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan did not lose many officers, high-ranking military officials. In the West, we are projecting our military doctrine upon non-governmental organizations and non-state actors. So we think when their leader dies, it has the same impact as if when a leader here dies. Look, like You're not really old enough to remember this, but partway through the Afghanistan war, the Taliban announced out of nowhere, said, by the way, Mullah Omar has been dead for like 2.5 years. Like, everyone went, what? Like, no one noticed, because it didn't matter. It changed nothing. It changed absolutely nothing. Nobody who was fighting in Afghanistan or nobody who was governing Afghanistan noticed the difference between when Mullah Omar was alive and when he died. The Israelis are looking for anything to claim a trophy, to claim an accomplishment. But other than the mass killing of civilians, they actually haven't accomplished anything. They set out to either ethnically cleanse and expel the Palestinians. They set out to eliminate Hamas and to free the hostages. Have they done these things? No. Khalas. That's it. Any other questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yes, I understand. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. Mm-hmm. 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 Right. So the first thing I will say is this. The joke that your coworker made or your superior made was a joke of dehumanization, right? They care so little about the suffering of Palestinians that they could turn sales targets and things like that into something that is comparable to the threatening to subject people to unbelievable human suffering as a form of humor, right? Okay. As a general rule, I no longer debate with people, as a general rule. I find that it's not very good for me spiritually, and it's not a great use of my time. I prefer to speak to the Muslims, and I prefer to speak to people who want to learn, rather than trying to convince people who don't want to learn. Okay? But when people are genuinely interested, and they tell me, explain to me how the Palestinians feel. Okay? Give me a way to understand. And if I'm speaking to someone who is not particularly sophisticated, someone who has a very shallow understanding of the Middle East, of geopolitics, of the Muslim world, then this is what I say to them. I want you to imagine that you live in a home. And you live in a home with your family. And then one day, someone kicks in your door and claims that this house used to belong to them. Now, as far as you're concerned, you live in this house, your parents lived in this house, your grandparents lived in this house, and their grandparents lived in this house, and you have their photos, and you have evidence of their existence, and in fact, they're buried in your backyard. Okay? Your family history is woven into every piece of wood, every piece of drywall, every piece of glass, every blade of grass outside speaks to your family history. But these people come and say, yes, but it used to belong to us. And then they actually convince all of your neighbors that that's true. And your neighbors start to tell you that you never lived there. And you start to look around and you say, what's happening? Like, we were just, you know that I live here, right? Like, my name is written on the mail. And they say, let me see that. And then you give it to them and they say, what mail? And you say, give me my mail back. And they say, I don't remember you gave me any mail. So now the letter is gone. So now you're living in this spiraling dystopian world where everyone denies that you ever lived there. So you go to the mayor's office, and bizarrely, the mayor, it turns out, has a secret agreement with the people who just kicked in your door, and now the mayor agrees with them as well. And one day, these people who kicked in your door take you and your family, and at gunpoint, they kill a few of you, they assault some others, and then they stuff you all into the attic. So now, you used to live in this big, spacious home, but you're all stuffed in the attic, or into the closet, or into the basement, or whatever. You're all stuffed into one corner of the home. And periodically, the people who raided the home will come into the attic, or come into the basement, or come into the closet, and they'll kick your teeth in, and they'll kill one of you, and they'll assault another, and they'll pull your wife's hair, and they'll make fun of you, and they'll douse you with water, or whatever it is, and then they close the door, and then they go about their business. To the people who live in the attic, everything the home invaders do will seem perverse and unjust, including their birthday parties, including their celebrations, including their bedtime stories, including their lullabies. All of that will seem perverse and unjust to the people stuck in the attic. Right? If you're stuck with a cloth in your mouth and your hands tied to a chair, and you could hear someone singing a lullaby to their daughter in what used to be your daughter's room, you're not going to think, oh my God, that's so cute. That's like what I used to do with my daughter. You're going to think, that's my daughter's room. That's my bed. And I'm stuck in the closet. This is how I usually explain this to someone who doesn't really understand the Palestinian people. And this brings me to the second point, which is that the legal standing and the entire history of Hamas, or Fatah, or Saraya al-Quds, or blah, 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 none of this actually matters. Wallahi, it doesn't. Okay? Because in the eyes of people who already submit to a Zionist worldview, the Palestinians are foreign actors with foreign and exotic motivations. So if you tell people, hey, I think this guy who has just been orphaned is probably going to want revenge in a couple of years because you've destroyed his home, killed his entire family, and now he wants to seek retribution for what you did to him. most of the time that story is too complicated for people to accept in the West, so they'll just say, well, he does this because he's a fanatic. He does this because he hates freedom, or he hates women, or something like that. Something stupid like this. And this is the way that most narratives operate here. This is why I don't argue with people. But if you find yourself in a situation where you have to argue with them, the first analogy helps. But again, I have found that most people who emerge from a Zionist worldview, they tend to do so on their own. There's nothing that I can say that will convince them. No amount of facts, no amount of evidence will convince them. It's just a soul searching that they have to do on their own. Look, if you have been watching the suffering of Palestinians for 10 months, and you've been... Netanyahu said in Congress yesterday that in Rafah, not a single civilian was killed. He said that in Congress, and all these monkeys stood up and applauded him, right? I've been watching this. Like, I'm watching this war with my own eyes. I think, man, that is amazing. I mean, this is like coming out. You guys ever read 1984? Right? Like, it's like coming out and saying war is peace and freedom is slavery, and all of these congressmen come up and cheer and they clap. And this is the type of world that you're dealing with. This is why I don't argue with people anymore. I will take, yes? Oh, yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Love it, yeah. So the question is basically, now that the United Nations has, I'm not sure the questioner is actually like entirely correct, but I'll paraphrase it anyway, saying now that the United Nations has officially recognized the injustice of the Israeli invasion on Gaza, and probably what they're alluding to more specifically is that the International Court of Justice has essentially determined that there is a plausible case of genocide here, and that the ICC is maybe issuing arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and the defense minister. That what implication will this have? International law only exists to the extent that it can be enforced. Okay? Here's what we have learned in the last 10 months. Okay? There are a set of, you hear a lot of time, like when you interact with your non-Muslim coworkers and things, they'll say, I'm a secular person, I don't have a religion. Yes? Okay, you hear this, right? But they do have a religion. It's not Christianity, but there's another religion they follow. And their religion has a set of deities. Those deities include rule of law, democracy, freedom of assembly, okay, free speech, right? They include international human rights, right? These are the deities of the modern secular person. And this is essentially the church of liberalism. Okay? And here's what we've discovered in the last 10 months. That the rules-based order, led by the United States primarily, will sacrifice every single one of these gods. They will sacrifice every single one of these deities before they sacrifice Zionism. Because America is more Zionist than it is liberal. America is more invested in the protection of Zionism than it is invested in the protection of freedom of speech, than it is invested in freedom of assembly, than it is invested in rule of law, than it is invested in anything else. It will sacrifice all of these things to save Israel. And the truth of the matter is that there is a theological component to this. Like, there is a huge evangelical base in the United States for whom Benjamin Netanyahu can go on TV, eat a Palestinian baby on live TV, and it would not matter. It would not mean anything to them. right? They would say these are God's chosen people. This needs to happen so that the Messiah can return and the second coming can commence and that Armageddon can be brought about. Khalas, there's nothing that you cannot reason with them. The best thing that has happened to the Muslims and for the people who are invested in the Palestinian plight is that we could finally say, وَأَخِيرًا, at last, we need to stop pretending like we are ever going to get justice from these institutions. The institutions like the ICC, and this is my personal opinion, by the way, I'm a cynic when it comes to this. The institutions like the ICC and the ICJ have been very useful in exposing Western hypocrisy, but they are not useful as vehicles for the pursuit of justice. Any other questions from the online? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So every few years, okay, I don't have time to get into the history of the schism between Hamas and Fatah. Though I do have a podcast episode about this. It's actually the last podcast episode that I did, and my podcast is called Preoccupation, a Not So Brief History of Palestine. So if they're interested in the history of the schism, listen to that last podcast episode. But I will say this. The PA, led by Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, is under enormous pressure to do something. Because the PA has effectively become Israel's subcontractor. Okay, they are basically an arm of the Israeli occupation. And so every time that something like this happens, whether in 2008, 2009, in 2011, 2012, in 2014, 2021, they make some overtures for reconciliation. And Hamas, politically speaking, can also not afford to be seen as an obstructionist. To say, no, we don't want to reconcile with you because you're a bunch of collaborators. And so there is this political theater that ultimately goes nowhere. And it will continue to go nowhere because the PA's salaries are determined on Israeli permission. Okay, like, and American compliance, because this is where their salaries are coming from. And so long as that persists, there will never be, they will never have a real incentive for real reconciliation. However, I want to go back to what I said nearing the end of the presentation, which is that every single Palestinian faction, including elements inside Fatah, are fighting with the resistance. The PA stands alone as an obstacle to all of the things that I mentioned earlier. The question of, do Palestinians have the right to resist? There is universal acceptance of this within Palestinian public discourse. Okay, universal acceptance of this. The PA stands alone as an obstacle to this. Right. Any other questions, feedback, remarks? Ahmed, I'll close off with this. Go ahead.
So how would you say that the war is in the Quran, according to the Hadith, it says that the worldly preservation is possible?
So how do I believe that this war ends in the grand sense of, because you were making a mention of what we can learn from the Quran and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or how do I believe that this immediate war right in front of us will end, this particular chapter? In both cases, most of what I do is a reading of history, not predicting the future. On the one hand, look, we've learned so much in the last 10 months. Another thing that we've learned is that Israelis hate Palestinians way more than they love Israelis. Like I thought, if you had asked me before the war, I'd say their love of themselves, because they're so full of themselves, that their love of themselves is so great that they will free their hostages, in like 2 or 3 months. It turns out, no, they would rather kill Palestinians and Israelis than do anything else. Their level of bloodlust is like spectacular. So that's something that I've learned. I did not think that the resistance would be able to hold out for 10 months. As someone who has been following this for years, I didn't think so, and yet they have. I did not think that Netanyahu would be able to withstand the domestic pressure, and I underestimated him. He is a political savage. He is a political animal. He is a survivalist. I still believe that escalation is more likely than a ceasefire. So what I mean by that is, I feel that it is more likely that the war expands into southern Lebanon, or maybe further escalation with Yemen, than my belief that a ceasefire is around the corner. And that's about as far into the future as I'm willing to go. Okay. بارك الله فيكم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.